Paul Blustein is a writer who focuses on trade, the IMF, and World Bank. He's a former staff at the Washington Post. He covered economic policy and related issues and served as Asian economics correspondent in Tokyo for 5 years. With the economic crisis, there seems to be a fair amount of confusion on how the International Monetary Fund actually operates. I spoke to Paul Blustein and asked him to explain what the IMF's operation is.
Well, the IMF is sort of like a credit union for countries, and all countries in the world kind of pool their resources and put it in one kitty, one pot, and then when a country gets into trouble, then that country is entitled to sort of take some resources out for a period of time, and the idea is to sort of tide that country over until it can get its affairs in order, because unfair as it seems, countries need what's called hard currency. These are dollars and euros and Japanese yen, the main currencies of the world, so that they can import what they need to in times of stress. They need pharmaceuticals, they need machinery to keep their economies running. Now, for Greece, of course, there's no issue with needing hard currency because Greece is a euro country. But anyway, that's generally the way it works. The IMF is a kind of a pool of hard currencies that countries can draw from when they need to be just tided over in times of crisis.
Your book, The Chastening, examines the role of the International Monetary Fund in a series of economic crises. Why has the IMF become the object of intense political controversy?
When the IMF agrees to give a loan to a country that's in crisis and that needs a temporary loan to tide it over, it imposes conditions on the country. It says, if I'm going to lend you this money, I want to expect to be paid back, and that means you have to take the steps that we think is necessary for you to be able to pay back. I mean, that's not so different from when a bank extends a loan to a company that's in some kind of distress, and the bank says, well, you're going to have to, lay some people off, or you're going to have to cut some operations. We want to make sure that we're going to get paid back. And often, in fact, the IMF imposes conditions that a country's leaders may secretly think are desirable. It's kind of handy. They can blame the IMF for imposing those conditions, but of course that does make the IMF the object of a lot of hatred.
The IMF has sought to cultivate an image of economic masterminds that are giving out effective economic remedies. Now, based on its track record, does the IMF have the ability to combat financial crisis on a national level?
Well, this is really the problem, is that they have cultivated this image. They try to cultivate this image that when the IMF comes in and gives a program, what's called a program to a country, and gives them a loan and a set of conditions, that everything should be fine now. Okay, we fixed the problem. We've given the loan. We're tiding the country over. Everyone just settle down, go home, and stop panicking. But the problem is that in today's massive international capital markets, with so much money swirling around the world, these programs often aren't effective. Sometimes the markets need to accept discipline themselves. They need to do things. I mean, the classic example of this was the Korean crisis in 1997, when the banks that were yanking money out of Korea like crazy in a big panic had to be organized and told, you have to stop yanking money out of this country. You have to agree to stop doing this. Until that happened, until that was all organized, no amount of IMF money and no amount of conditions that were imposed on Korea worked. So these things don't always work. Sometimes they do, but often they don't. So this is one of the big flaws in the whole system that we have now.
Now, you mentioned before money swirling around the world. Are we talking about real money, or are we talking about zeros on a computer?
Well, I assume by that question that what you're asking me about are the so-called naked swaps and just the sort of the bets that people can make in the markets by just betting that something will go down. No, I mean, I'm talking about real money too. But yes, of course, in some cases, one of the factors that causes markets to panic and the panic to feed on itself is the fact that people can speculate without actually, in some sense, buying real assets. But that, I think it's unfortunate that factor is being blamed as, the main force in the current crisis in Europe. But the fact is, the markets in general are just so huge, so interconnected, there's so much money that's allowed to cross borders that it's very difficult for the international institutions we have to be able to come up with rules and systems and methods of preventing panics. and also very difficult for them to prevent situations where too much money goes into a country in the first place, and the citizens get to enjoy that, and they think that everything's fine, and they think everything's hunky-dory, and interest rates are low, and the country doesn't have to worry about running any kind of disciplined economic policy. The policymakers get lulled into complacency. This is the problem of the boom and bust cycle, and that's what I think is fair to say is a problem that's been plaguing a lot of countries in the Eurozone and in the United States.
The IMF cooperates with governments to find ways to collect money. Usually what they do, at least this is the case in Greece so far, they're cutting wages and pensions, they're increasing taxes. But we haven't seen any proposals in terms of development of this country, besides selling off to private foreign corporations the country's national resources, such as water and electricity. When do the development measures come into the picture?
Well, the IMF is not a development institution. The World Bank is, but Greece, of course, is not a country that is anywhere near poor enough to be borrowing from the World Bank. It hasn't been for many years, many decades. What the IMF does is, again, it's a kind of a short-term crisis lending institution for a country that's in need of a quick loan to tide it over until it can get back on its feet. And, of course, they would like the country to arrange its finances in such a way as to promote the best long-term development, but they also want to make sure that the country can afford to pay its bills. Again, it's the same as any bank going to any troubled business. They want, first of all, to make sure that the company can stand on its own before expanding. And so that's sort of what the purpose of the IMF is. So they're not going to come in and say, gee, we'd like you to start spending a lot of money on, new ports, new highways, new telecoms network or something like that. That's not what they're in the business of doing. They're in the business of tiding countries over through crises, and that means belt tightening, and it's justified that they're going to ask that of a country that they extend loans to.
Well, this is where my question on development comes in. If the IMF wants to make sure that it's going to get its money back, how come it doesn't involve itself in helping countries implement development measures that will guarantee that their money will be given back?
Well, yes. I mean, sometimes these austerity measures can be self-defeating because if they're asking too much belt-tightening on the part of a country, the country will fall further into recession and will be less able to pay back. So it's a delicate balance that they have to strike. But I guess when I hear you use the word development measures, I tend to think of kind of long-term measures that a government can take, as I say, sort of building ports or improving the education system. These are all things that are very good and desirable, and the IMF, isn't opposed to that sort of thing. But those are things that only pay off over a very long term. And the IMF is not supposed to be a long-term lender. It's supposed to be a short-term lender. Again, it's there to sort of tide countries over relatively brief, 2 to 3 year periods, whereas the World Bank will lend for, 8, 9, 10 years to a country. So there's an important difference between development lending and crisis lending. Crisis lending is supposed to be short-term, and when you talk about development, those are all very, desirable goals. And you're right, they will put a country in a much better position to stand on its own feet in the long run, but that's not what a country in crisis needs to focus on. A country in crisis needs to focus on making sure that it can pay its bills, go to the markets, and borrow on its own before it can turn to those other priorities.
And that was author Paul Blustein.